Welcome back to the Columbia studio. We are at this time.
Control at T-minus
This is shuttle control.
And holding. We have been holding now for approximately 45 minutes and have approximately 16 minutes remaining in the time before we would have to realign the IMUs. We have been told by Houston that they're extremely stable and we may be able to extend the hold slightly beyond what is normally contemplated. At the present time, we have not had a reading as to how we're listening now to Houston, where they are talking about what may be the possible problem that caused the backup software to look as though it might not be satisfactory. But at the present time, we do not have a determination as to how long we may hold at this particular point. There has to be a decision in the near future as to whether to go back to a different point in the countdown. But at the present time, we're at T-minus 9 minutes and holding. This is shuttle launch control.
So a quick interpretation of what all that means. At T-minus 9 minutes before the launch, the hold was instigated, caused by, we believe, a fault in a computer system on board Columbia, which was indicating excess water production from fuel cell number 3. They think it's a computer problem, not a systems problem. Let's have the latest news now from Kieran Prenderville at the Cape.
Hello, Mike. Well,
Kieran.
As you've just heard, they've been holding now for about 45 minutes instead of the scheduled 10 minutes. There is a concern, incidentally, from the people watching the fuel cells that there was too much of a load put on them, and they've switched back to sharing that with the ground system. It's all rather a pity. After the excitement of the last couple of days, there's rather a pall of gloom that's settled over Cape Canaveral at the moment. We're all waiting for news as you are, and as soon as we have something, we'll get back to you.
So, hardly surprising, we hear from Kieran Prenderville that the atmosphere at the Cape is somewhat gloomy at this time. By this time, Columbia should have been in her first orbit. She's not. She's still sitting on the pad. After so many delays, what frustration at this time. Jeffrey, have we reached the stage, or are we reaching it, where there might now be a long delay on this attempted launch?
No, we have about 14 minutes left, even on the present assessment, but the platform, which is this critical thing, this base on which they determine where they are, appears to be so stable that they may be able to hold it longer than that. It's very ironic that it is the software, in other words, the measuring and the controlling thing, which appears to be wrong rather than the units themselves. But I think we are talking simply a question of delay. I don't see anything at the moment suggesting that they are finding anything in the system which is fundamentally wrong. Once you have to start getting screwdrivers out and changing hardware, that's when your problems come. So I think we're talking of minutes or even possibly fractions of an hour rather than anything catastrophic. But we shall know, obviously, when they've finally determined this fifth computer and what situation it really is in.
Do we have anything new from launch control?
Who's doing this, since it only takes us back to minus 20?
We were approaching a deadline at 1:30, where a fundamental decision would have to be made. But from what you're saying and what we were picking up from Houston and the Cape, they might be able to extend this temporary hold, if I can put it that way, without having to cycle back to some 50 minutes before launch.
That's right, and indeed they can't say themselves at the moment because this platform is behaving so well. It's a very good sign for the future, in fact, that the future in terms of the flight itself, that the main equipment is holding up so well. So we're really in the software, the actual information part of the system rather than the hardware part.
We're talking about the information system. I wonder how the two fellows who are actually flying the thing, or hope to fly, are feeling now. I wonder if Kieran at the Cape has had any chance to either talk with the astronauts or their colleagues. What does he feel they will be thinking now? Kieran at the Cape.
Well, you can make your own stab at guessing what must be going through the minds of the two astronauts, squatting on top of 500,000 gallons of liquid propellant and 1,000 tons of solid rocket fuel. Now, incredibly enough, their heart rate just before we came on air was absolutely normal, according to NASA. I wouldn't like to hazard a guess as whether that's the case now. Incidentally, there were a few minor hitches this morning before this latest one. There was a blown fuse in one of the fuel pumps, and then shortly after that, a leak in a feed line from the hydrogen storage tank. That's not the external tank, that's the storage tank which fuels it. Still, those faults were quickly put right. This one we're hoping will be put right, though not, obviously, as quickly. I'm afraid we don't yet have any more information about that.
Kieran, thank you very much at the Cape. So I fear slight gloom and despondency from Cape Canaveral. Columbia still on the launch pad now, 40 minutes after her scheduled departure. Back to regular programs now. We will be continuing to monitor the progress of Columbia, or lack of it, and when there is something to report, then rest assured we will be back with you here in the Columbia studio. Until then, that's it from us here. Good afternoon to you from the Columbia studio, and the news is that the American shuttle will not go today. Disappointing news indeed, because up to 11 minutes ago it did appear that the problems which had dogged the launch at its scheduled time of 10 minutes to 1 this afternoon had been put right, things had been reorganized for a launch just 10 minutes from now. Then, 11 minutes ago, we heard the news that the initial problem with the computer system had not been sorted out, and that the much-troubled American space shuttle will stay on the ground for at least the next 48 hours. This is how we heard the news from Shuttle Launch Control at Kennedy Space Center. We heard that Columbia was not going to fly today.
The launch director, George Page, and Center Director Dick Smith have just announced that we will scrub the launch attempt for today. We will stop the clock probably at the T-minus 9-minute point and send out a crew to open the hatch of the orbiter and take the crew back to the astronaut quarters. The earliest time in which we could possibly reschedule the launch will be for Sunday morning at 6:50 a.m. What this is dependent on, of course, is resolution of the problem which we have had in today's launch attempt. That problem has not been traced to whether it is strictly a software problem or whether it's possibly has something to do with the hardware. What has occurred has been that there are 5 flight computers on board the orbiter. The normal configuration for a launch is that 4 of them are programmed for the ascent run, and the 5th has a backup program in it. Each time as we went down the countdown, there was an inability of the backup computer to communicate properly with the other 4 general-purpose computers. We have attempted to check out the program. The program that was in the backup computer was the proper program, the one that we had planned to put there. However, what that does not say is whether there is some problem that is in that program which is not understood at this moment. In any case, we have to recycle, and we'll have a determination probably later today as to whether to reschedule for Sunday. The reason that Sunday would be the earliest possible time we could schedule for has to do with the conditioning of the liquid hydrogen tank in the external tank. This is the tank which supplies the fuel to the main engines on the orbiter. The liquid hydrogen which is placed in the tank is a very, very cold minus 423 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. In order to ensure that there be no damage to the metal in the tank, there has to be at least a 24-hour conditioning period after the liquid hydrogen is drained from that tank before liquid hydrogen can again be placed in it. Since we are this late in the launch window at this time, it will not be possible to drain that and then have the proper conditioning period and then reload it in time to schedule a launch for tomorrow. So at the present time, we have terminated our launch attempt for today and will reschedule for no earlier than Sunday morning at 6:50 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is Shuttle Launch Control.
So that's the sad news, recorded just 10 minutes or so ago, that Columbia will not lift off. In fact, news is coming through all the time of what is happening at the Cape. So let's go live now to Cape Canaveral and the hopefully reasonably cheerful voice of Kieran Prendeville.
Hello, Michael. Yes, we are out of the game this time. The earliest launch will now have to be Sunday because, as you heard, they can't possibly empty the external fuel tank and refill it in less than 48 hours. The problem was with the backup computer on the shuttle orbiter, which wasn't talking any sense to the other four. It's perhaps interesting that the company which programmed the software for the fifth computer is a different company from that which programmed the other four. So whether that has any significance, I can't say. Now, as that fifth computer is supposed to be backstop for the other four, that is, NASA felt there was no way they could launch. And with so much at stake here, in particular the lives of two astronauts, well, that's not too hard to understand. Mike.
Kieran, thank you very much indeed. Kieran Prendeville stirring it up a little bit at the Cape, but the sad news is no launch today and no likelihood of any launch for at least 48 hours. Well, waiting patiently with me here in the studio in the United Kingdom has been Geoffrey Pardo. Geoffrey, disappointing for all of us, I think.
Well, it is disappointing, of course. I think it's an interesting point that we are suffering, the shuttle people are suffering from the advance in technology in a strange way. Each of these computers is capable of handling hundreds of thousands of pieces of information, storing it, memorizing it, and acting on it. Now, the value of a computer is that it can, in fact, do these things remarkably rapidly in millionths of a second. But we come to the point, of course, that it takes a human being to program it in. And if you get a situation such as this, where there is some apparent fault within the software of it, then incredibly you cannot speed up the human mind to instantly scan what is then several millions of different combinations to sort it out. So whilst it all goes well, fine, we have no problem, but we have a classical situation now where we are buried within and dependent on the technology. It's the same sort of problem I think we see in the use of computers in a more domestic environment.
When technology is so sophisticated, it's impossible to tell quickly where the fault is lying.
Well, that's right, and now they have to go back to a slower sort of, not just a manual examination, but nevertheless they now have to look at the thing piecemeal. And of course the other thing is this point that Kieran just made, that the computers are programmed by a different company. I don't think necessarily this shouldn't be a fundamental problem, because essentially they are putting in instructions and they are putting in data which should be compatible. I think the thing which, if anything, surprises me, it's the fact that it took this time into a few minutes from liftoff, virtually, to find that there was some sort of apparent incompatibility.
Well, let's go back briefly over the day's events. We got to T-9 in the original count about 20 to 1 this afternoon, and the problem arose, and initially it looked as if it was a problem in a fuel cell, something within the system of the spacecraft itself.
That's right. And at that point it wasn't clear, of course, whether the sensor, which was saying what was wrong, was at fault, or whether the computer scanning this was at fault. It's still possible that the computer had a bit of a problem associated with that. I say possible, but not probable, because later we heard that the odds may have been that they were somewhat overloading the demand on that one of the three fuel cells, which of course produce the main electricity. But because it's coupled into the ground facilities at this time, then of course they should or could have had an ability not to load the spacecraft fuel cells too much, but to rely more on the power from the main site. Now that appears to have been cleared up satisfactorily, and then of course we got to this other thing. So there's just a very small possibility the two may be connected in some way. I think it's more likely that there was some unfound situation in the actual computer programming so far, which for some incredible reason didn't show up till right this last moment.
It is surprising, isn't it?
It is a little bit.
And then what they had to do was take the entire computer program in number 5, the backup computer, and run it through some system at Houston.
Well, there were two things to be done at that point. Firstly, was there a wrong program in this fifth backup computer? Now that may sound rather incredible, but in fact computer programs are being modified the whole time, and over the years gradually they perfect the instructions as well as the data stored in it. So the first thing was to dump, so-called, the information out and compare it with the master banks as to what it should be doing. This took, as we know, the best part of half an hour or so, and then they found that apparently it was the right program. Now this, in a way, was rather disappointing, because had they found that there was some small piece of information wrong, it would have been much easier to correct it at that time. So now we have the irony of the program being correct, the other 4 programs being correct in the main computers, and this inability to check with each other and communicate between these computers. Now here we have, of course, the slight possibility, as they said in that announcement, that there may be some small part of the electronic circuitry at fault. Then that is a problem, because you can't change the circuitry, then you've got to change the computer. Now, okay, in the 48 hours, it's certainly physically possible to plug it in and out, but that's why they're now busily working on, is it hardware, is it software, and how does it gear back to the whole of the hardware?
So the shuttle, which has had a tough history over so many years, is having a tough time even in the build-up to its launch.
That's
Jeffrey,
right.
let's wait for a second or two. Let's put a hold into this one at this stage and go live to the Cape again to get the latest from Kieran.
Hello, Mike. Yes, Cape Canaveral is now echoing to the sounds of a circus leaving town. Trailers are being hitched up and driven out. There's thousands of reporters from all over the world trying to rebook the hotel rooms they checked out of earlier today. I suppose the only bit of good news I can give you is that you may remember that earlier I was wondering where Bo Derek and Gregory Peck and all the rest of the Hollywood stars were that were supposed to be here. Well, I'm now informed by a reliable source that Clint Eastwood has been frustrated along with the rest of us here, as well as Angie Dickinson, Pat Boone and John Denver. I can even tell you that the governor of Florida was playing baseball in front of the grandstand. So at least someone was having a nice time. Back to you, mate.
Thank you, Kieran. Thank you very much indeed. Let's have one quick word from Jeffrey. How quickly could they possibly get this system back on the road again? Is 48 hours realistic?
Yes, it's possible. It depends very much as to whether they find there's some fundamental reprogramming. They couldn't reprogram the whole thing in that time, but I think there's a very good chance that, given a few hours, not under the pressures, as it were, which they certainly have at the present moment, they can determine it. I mean, it's not as if it's starting from scratch, no question of that at all. But the key thing is to find out why it happened. Then I think there's a very good chance with the facilities available to really move in and get things ready for launch in 2 days.
So 48 hours is not out of the question?
Not out of the question at all,
Indeed.
no.
Jeffrey Pardo, many thanks indeed. So there it is, the sad news: Columbia will not make her launch date. Indeed, her schedule has been a tricky one ever since she was first conceived. Let's end this first programme, because indeed we'll keep you posted throughout the project as best we can as to what is happening, and when the great event does take place, we will be there to cover it. But let's hear once again the news from Space Center Control at Cape Canaveral in Florida, which told us that today the American Space Shuttle was going to stay on the ground.
The launch director, George Page, and center director, Dick Smith, have just announced that we will scrub the launch attempt for today. We will stop the clock probably at the T-minus 9-minute point and send out a crew to open the hatch of the orbiter and take the crew back to the astronaut quarters. The earliest time in which we could possibly reschedule the launch will be for Sunday morning at 6:50 a.m. What this is dependent on, of course, is resolution of the problem which we have had in today's launch attempt. That problem has not been traced to whether it is strictly a software problem or whether it's possibly has something to do with the hardware. What has occurred has been that there are 5 flight computers on board the orbiter. The normal configuration for a launch is that 4 of them are programmed for the ascent run, and the 5th has a backup program in it. Each time as we went down the countdown, there was an inability of the backup computer to communicate properly with the other 4 general purpose computers. We have attempted to check out the program. The program that was in the backup computer was the proper program, the one that we had planned to put there. However, what that does not say is whether there is some problem that is in that program which is not understood at this moment. In any case, we have to recycle, and we'll have a determination probably later today as to whether to reschedule for Sunday. The reason that Sunday would be the earliest possible time we could schedule for has to do with the conditioning of the liquid hydrogen tank in the external tank. This is the tank which supplies the fuel to the main engines on the orbiter. The liquid hydrogen which is placed in the tank is a very, very cold minus 423 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. In order to ensure that there be no damage to the metal in the tank, there has to be at least a 24-hour conditioning period after the liquid hydrogen is drained from that tank before liquid hydrogen can again be placed in it. Since we are this late in the launch window at this time, it will not be possible to drain that and then have the proper conditioning period and then reload it in time to schedule a launch for tomorrow. So at the present time, we have terminated our launch attempt for today and will reschedule for no earlier than Sunday morning at 6:50 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. This is Shuttle Launch Control.
Columbia stays on Earth, it may get up on Sunday. The IRA man wins the by-election. Poland's Prime Minister gives an ultimatum. President Reagan may go home tomorrow. And Graham Gooch has been laying about him. Good evening. The Space Shuttle Columbia, which ought to have been orbiting the Earth tonight, is still on its launch pad at Cape Canaveral. It could go up at Sunday lunchtime, but they have not corrected the fault yet. It's a computer fault. One of the 5 computers on board is not in touch with the others. Now, it may be that it's not properly synchronized, but they're not sure. And when it went wrong twice today, that was that. Officials admitted later that they had not run a full test program in trials with the computers on board. From the Cape, Norman Reese.
It had been a warm, cloudless night on the Cape, and all systems on the floodlit Columbia were working perfectly when astronauts Young and Crippen were woken just after 4 in the morning local time. So, over a meal of steak and eggs, Flight Commander John Young confidently raised his coffee cup to toast a successful first launch. Breakfast over, the astronauts kitted up in their pressurized flying suits, suits that would have been needed had they been required to eject from Columbia in a sudden emergency. 50-year-old Young is the veteran of 4 previous space flights. For fellow pilot Bob Crippen, aged 43, today's launch would have been his first. Before entering the shuttle, there was a last personal word with some NASA technicians, people the astronauts hoped they wouldn't be seeing again until their return to the Cape after a successful 54 hours in orbit and a landing in California. As daylight broke over the Space Center, the countdown was going smoothly. Weather conditions were ideal, and roads for miles round were lined with cars as an estimated 1 million people converged on vantage points to view the launch. With the countdown on hold and 9 minutes left, everything seemed set to go. Then came a problem with the fuel cells that provide the shuttle's electricity. That one was quickly put right. But shortly afterwards came the second and what proved to be the critical setback. Trouble with a backup computer, one of 5 on board the orbiter.
This is Shuttle Launch Control at T-minus 9 minutes and holding. At the present time, we are in the process of dumping the program which is in the backup flight computer. It's called the backup flight software, and are going to re-enter that program into the computer. We had thought that this particular problem had gone away, but apparently it had not.
The backup computer on Columbia was refusing to exchange information with the other onboard computers. It was a phenomenon space engineers had never encountered before. One of them said later, it made our screens light up like a Christmas tree. As the delay continued, a second launch time was scheduled 3.5 hours later than planned. The astronauts and mission controllers tried everything they knew to put things right, but it was obvious the problem was refusing to go away.
We're all agreed that the probability that this is going to clear it up is not really that great. It might be that it will, but we're not heavily confident.
Okay, I understand.
Reporters and cameramen from around the world, most of whom had been here all night, caught a nap or just waited to be told what would happen next. NASA's top officials held a final conference among themselves and reluctantly concluded that the launch would have to be postponed.
The launch director, George Page, and Center Director Dick Smith have just announced that we will scrub the launch attempt for today. We will stop the clock probably at the T-minus 9-minute point and send out a crew to open the hatch of the orbiter and take the crew back to the astronaut quarters. The earliest time in which we could possibly reschedule the launch will be for Sunday morning at 6:50 a.m. What this is dependent on, of course, is resolution of the problem which we have had in today's launch attempt.
So the countdown clock has stopped here at the Kennedy Space Center, and tracing the problem that caused it to halt could well cause delays that extend beyond Sunday. Scientists here are making no secret of the fact that they find the whole situation extremely puzzling, and that they cannot yet agree, even amongst themselves, about what exactly is wrong.
We've all got our own pet theories about what's going on here. Probably the one you hear the most, and it's just a theory, we haven't proven this yet, and of course we're in the process trying to figure out a way to prove it or disprove it, is that we got a timing skew that we have never seen before between the pass and the backup in the way they were transferring information. Now, to give you an idea of how tight the window is, we have a 5-millisecond window that backup computer has got to get an instruction from the primary set to listen on all 4 of the flight critical buses.
So, after 6 hours, 10 minutes on board Columbia, astronauts Young and Crippen emerged not in the way and certainly not in the place they intended. Now they wait to see when they can try again. Norman Reese, News at 10 at the Kennedy Space Center.
And now David Scott, who flew in Apollo 9 and landed on the moon with Apollo 15, and who's been listening to NASA all day. Just how bad a black eye is it?
Black eye? I think it's not a black eye, Mr. As a matter of fact, I think people need to realize that this is an experimental flight, and this is the first time that this very sophisticated piece of machinery has actually progressed right down to the launch point. And I believe it demonstrates not only the vigor of the country, but our scientific strength and our technological expertise, and the fact that we have an open society in which everybody can watch everything we do. So you have to realize that it's not the days of mature Apollo systems. It's an experimental flight, and we expect to have some surprises. We had one today, but I'm sure they'll recover.
Now, are you surprised that it seems that the computer program wasn't fully tested with the computers on board?
Well, yes, I am. I'm surprised in one way, but not in another. Again, not until the day of the actual launch do you get to do everything that you do on the day of the actual launch. And if we look back at the past, Apollo 14 had a computer problem just before it went down to land, and even Apollo 11, if we remember, Neil Armstrong had a computer problem just before he landed. So we have seen these surprises before. They're surprises. I am surprised that it happened, but on the other hand, with the complex machinery we have, I'm not surprised that an experimental flight like this has a little problem.
Now, do you think it could be a long delay?
It's hard to tell. You know, we're hearing a number of opinions, and it's very difficult. It could be a long delay. On the other hand, somebody tonight might find the solution, and it would go as planned on Sunday.
Now, the crew said that they weren't heavily confident about the flight. That was late on this afternoon. What does a stop like this do to morale?
Well, of course, it's very disappointing for them today, having been geared up and ready to go on this precise day and everything going so well. But we'll find that they'll fall back and regroup, if you will, and get their enthusiasm up again, and tomorrow morning they'd be ready to go just as they were today.
Now, hasn't the whole shuttle program been dogged by disappointment over the years?
Well, again, I'd like to emphasize the fact that this is an experimental program and that the things that happen are publicized widely. If we were to do this in secret, you'd never hear of anything until it launched. It hasn't been dogged by any problems more than other experimental programs. As a matter of fact, I would say that it's been more successful than Apollo in its development.
Thank you very much, Sandy.